introducing the panel from left to right. So Jake Erickson, Catherine Lawless. I have to look at my list, so I know I have problems and get embarrassing. So Noreen Rian and Gina Menzies. So thank you to all of them for participating. Perhaps we could, don't want to be patriarchal, but if we could start with Jake, since I started with you. I mean, for all of you to respond to the things that inspired you. You're dying to have a conversation with Mary about. So if each of you would do that, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for that talk, Mary. That was just exceptional as usual. I think for those who've experienced your words time and time again. I was telling Dr. Hunt earlier that when I first began studying religion in the first 2 weeks of my first year religion course in my undergraduate degree, which was a course called The Family and Friends of God, we read Fierce Tenderness. And so Mary Hunt, alongside of Renita Weems's work, Battered Love, became my introduction to religion, and I've been studying with feminist theologians ever since, because as a queer gay male, the allied work and the resonance of feminist scholarship in religion has been something that has been hearing me to speech, in the words of Nell Morton, for a long time. And it's been so vital to have that resonance. Dr. Hunt's work in particular, I think, is of particular love because of the great juxtapositions she puts together. Fierce tenderness, the poetics of those two seemingly opposite words put together, the study of religion and feminist theory putting together, and opening up a creative and generative space to empower others time and time again. So I thank you for that. I think the thing that resonated for me tonight was your language of searching for spiritual survival, particularly for me as someone who works on environmental ethics and the immense environmental despair that comes with our current climatological moment, our ecocidal moment, the eco-patriarchal moment that is destroying the planet at such intense rates. 80% of insects in Germany gone over the past few years, biodiversity spirals, etc. And it seems to me that it's more vital than ever that feminist theory be heard, partially because those resources are there for navigating rituals of resilience, survival, empowerment, liberation, but also because as a deep critique of the dominant narrative of what's happening, especially, say, in Pope Francis's encyclical, where the women are the global leaders in climate justice movements, right? From my own home near Standing Rock, where Indigenous women called against the North Dakota pipeline, to global women and ecofeminists from Catholic traditions like Yvonne Guevara, for instance, who have always inspired me. And so that environmental and planetary solidarity time and time again becomes an important and recurring theme. So that's my thought.
Thanks. Do you just speak into this?
Respond to that?
Well, I think we probably want to hear from everybody.
Yeah. Okay, great.
There's enough of me.
Well, I think I'm the only non-theologian on the panel, so I'm at a disadvantage, I'm afraid. But I come to my interest in religion from a medieval background. I work on medieval religion and the medieval representations within religion. So, I suppose two things, 2 points of contact apart from general feminist, concerns and desire for change and desire for activist change, and the relationship between the academy and action. These are obviously general things that we all can come to and share, but things from my own work that sort of hit off some of the things that you were saying. One, is you're fearful of replicating, that this could, and I'm just reminded of the great spiritual movement of the Middle Ages, the penitential movement, where you had these women, pinsocere, or beguines they were called in Northern Europe, who really formed alternative churches, but very, very quickly they used the terminology of the main church. So you had the patriarchy really being replaced by female figures, until of course they were shut down because they're getting a little bit too powerful for the established church. And that's one thing. And then the other thing that I was thinking about, I'm an art historian, so when you were talking about the National Museum for Women in the Arts, and you were talking then also about the great traditions that have it informed so much of our art, of our poetry, of our music, of our texts, of our culture, and how we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, what tools we can have to look back at these traditions and draw out from them. Why were there no great women artists was the great question formed by Linda Nochlin. Of course there were, there are. And how do we not replicate reproducing these institutional structures that exclude?
Avoided Garmagad, it was avoided. Sin Harve, Alling, Agus Land of Yocht. So, Mary, thank you so much for being such an inspiration to us and giving us that fire in the belly. I couldn't help thinking of the passage from Peter. Always be ready to make an accounting of the hope that's in you. But do it with respect and with a clear conscience. And you're a soul searcher, Mary, and so are we all. Soul searchers, soul seekers, soul hunters. And I was also thinking, I had an old aunt, she's passed over, and she used to say, when she would be getting intuition, she'd say, I feel it in me waters. And you certainly, on every level, make us feel it in our waters. And so two things that inspired me very greatly was when you were talking about our history, the history of Ireland, and merging that with the crisis that we are in, the greatest crisis since the Reformation, as Hans Kuhn described it, but for us, much, much even a greater crisis altogether. And thinking, about our translation of the Hopi saying, the time of the lone wolf is over, gather yourselves. We are the ones we've been waiting for. And of course we have that in Irish. Níneart gacur le chéile, in power we are together. And also, ska chéile a bharan na daoine, in the shadow, in the shelter of each other, we exist. But the other thing I wanted to pick up was on your third advice there to us, which is to look to the riches of the traditions, of all the traditions, and none. There are 4,200 religions in the world. Now these are branches, of course, of the 8 trees of the major religions, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, and so on. But all religions agree on one thing. I wonder, could you hazard a guess? The golden rule. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. All religions agree on that. Listen to others as you would have them listen to you. Would we be in that mess if we were able to listen? Because, of course, listening is a feminine sense. That's not my research. It's the research of Ernest Berendt. But we fear listening to one another. I also love that word dialogue, Mary, because if you look at that, our word for God in Irish is dia, dialogue, that we're talking about that spirit there. And so I was very, very struck by all of that and very inspired by so much of what you said. Thank you so much.
Gina.
Thank you, Mary, and particularly thank you because I read recently where you were talking about how the Catholic Church in particular, when it talks about human sexuality, it sort of works from this ideology of complementarity. And I do think that is something that has to be radically deconstructed. But some other things that I think are really interesting, you did touch on it in relation to Ireland and the US, that I think many people in Ireland have now, the word mightn't be the right one, is sort of leapfrogged or passed out the church in their thinking and in their adherence to a real gospel. I don't know how that will develop further, but I think that's in a way where many people in Ireland are today. And that brings up, I suppose, something that is consoling but also in a way somewhat stressful. Comfort in diversity. I like that phrase. And again, I don't know if it wouldn't be maybe, well, it is about the inter I suppose, academic disciplines, but in Harvard and McKinsey, they have actually looked at the whole notion of diversity in relation to successful companies. But you can take their findings, which are very scientifically based, and relate that to the world and to all other movements that where there is diversity, there is an enhanced richness. And of course, you rightly point out that in all the religious traditions, half of those who've been members of that tradition have been excluded. So, I mean, the need for diversity is crying from the rooftops. And in the light of that, I suppose one of my more specific questions is when you look at, I suppose, particularly the Catholic teaching, but I think all the religious teaching in relation to women and particularly in relation to human sexuality, you kind of come up against a tradition that is almost locked in. But when they talk about social justice and really thinking of the current Pope, and social justice and climate change and many other things, and even economics, that they look outside the tradition and they dialogue with experts in the world. But when it comes to human sexuality, it's as if we know it all, we don't need to dialogue with anybody, and we're back somewhere, I think, in the 5th century or maybe even the 15th century. But I sort of wonder, what is your thinking as to why that is as it is, why the diversity and the seeking of knowledge from all sources is not available when it comes to a theology of human sexuality, which I think the world, not just the churches, urgently need today. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Wonderful responses and entirely too kind. We've got lots of work to do. But let me try to just make a quick response to each one, and then we'll open it up for others. Jake, I want to say a couple of things. One is that I think I taught a class some years ago at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley on the feminist roots of queer theology. Mm-hmm. And I do think that that's a really salient reason why people like yourself and others who do queer theology are involved in feminism, because those two things are deeply intertwined. There wouldn't be queer theology if there hadn't been feminist theology ahead of it. That said, I think the twin issue there that you're dealing with, which is ecocide and the literal survival of the earth, is enormously important, and one of the, not enormously important, probably the signal issue. But I'm hesitant to put it that way because feminists have always been on board on ecology, but ecologists haven't been on board on feminism. Yeah. And that's been a very real problem. I remember saying this to Bill McKibben, the great Bill McKibben of his, who was one of the leaders of the 360 movement. 350 movement. A really terrific writer and ecologist, but I remember sitting in an audience like this, and one of my sisters of color came over to me and said, "You're a white woman, would you go speak to that white boy and explain to him that," because he didn't get it, he didn't understand, and he didn't have any reference at all to anti-racism, to women's questions. And if you just begin at the population question and look at issues around birth control, that leads me to the other question that you raised, which is Laudato Si, this papal document, and you bring it up too, Gina, in terms of how that document was informed by many resources well beyond the tradition. Usually if you read a Catholic document, the footnotes are all to earlier Catholic documents. It's very uncreative, it's anti-intellectual, and it's wrong. It just doesn't work. And Laudato Si is a good example of that the places where they didn't do their homework are the issues around women. and the notion that the understanding that we have from a gender studies perspective that what happens to more than half of the planet is not trivial, and that you can't do eco work without understanding the situation, especially of poor women of color around the world, and how they are disproportionately affected by the kinds of things that we talk about. But if you don't give them moral agency, if they're not seen as capable of making reproductive choices, making choices in terms of jobs and education, that all the rest of the document might as well just not have wasted the paper it's been written on. That's a methodological problem in the Catholic world that is endemic, and that leads to some of the questions that others on the panel have been raising, which is that this kind of, it's not just a blind spot. I think what we're seeing now is that it's a systematic, Mary Condren, you know a lot more about this in terms of the consciousness questions and the deep projections of evil on women and things feminine. That it's a very complicated theoretical issue, but it plays itself out in very real terms, in both in terms of Earth and more importantly, human inhabitants, namely women. And so I think it's urgent that we do this kind of work, find the roots of that, and eradicate them. Moving to your questions, Catherine, I'm a great fan of the Beguines. I think that they were early feminist spirituality articulators. I was once in Amsterdam visiting the Beguinhof there, and one of the women who was there, there still were, at least in recent years, women living there, and they said, oh, well, you and my partner and I were there. You're Christian women of good character. You could live here. And I thought, well, they only knew how good our character wasn't. But I think it's really exciting to see. And yet, one of the economic questions was that the people who were able to do that were also able to make their own living. And this, I think, raises an important question in terms of economic resources and how those of us in feminist work and religion have to begin in a serious way to socialize the resources we have so that lots of different people will have that possibility. The Beguines, for many of them, came from families where they could make a living and had the resources to do that, whether family money or not. I also was taken by your idea around the arts and the importance. Do we need to turn this one off? Yeah, we're getting feedback. Again, the economic issues I want to keep coming back to, because one of the reasons, and I pointed this out to this young man at the Prado the other day, he didn't expect it, I don't think, of some, tourist looking at pictures, but I was looking at Carla Peters, and I was particularly interested in... Is the exhibition still on? No, I don't think, at least not that I saw, I just saw a few of her paintings, but I'm taken by the fact that one of the reasons, because he said, well, we didn't know, of the women we know about, he said, well, there weren't women painting in those years. I said, that we know about. Okay, sepamos, my best Spanish. Okay, sepamos, that we know about. And he said, oh, well, maybe. And I said, well, women couldn't get money to have apprenticeships, to learn how to do these things, unless their fathers were painters. And one of the things you see in the Women's Museum in Washington is many of the early women painters had fathers, not mothers, but fathers who were painters. And therefore, they were able to do the work. And the people who started the Women's Museum, Wilhelmina Holliday and her husband, started that, and they started to collect these paintings 40 years ago. And they have amazing work, but it's because women didn't have the opportunity. And we don't know, it's the same as in the texts, we don't know them because no one took the time to look at them. And now that we see them as they emerge, we see that there were not only lots more than we knew, but the concrete economic anti-women issues were present then. So come see it again in Washington. Thank you so much, Noreen. Really, I know your music and I know some of your thinking, but you've articulated it tonight in a way that's so delightful for me to realize how much I need to study the Irish language in order to understand. And I love that people now are using it with such naturalness and ease, and the importance of it, and the importance of using the language of your ancestors and mine. My family is from County Offaly, and they really, we lost it all when they came. And, I think you also make a very important point about I feel it in the water, and I'm going to take that. You okay? You sure? I think we need to have that embroidered or something at the water office. I feel it in the water. We need somebody to embroider. And finally, Gina, to go back to your very helpful comments, I think the problem is where.
Mary, do move over this slide.
Oh, I can't turn it off. I'm sorry.
Talking about using technology.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Is it doing it again? Maybe it's my pearls. Exactly. I wanted to think a little bit about the question of complementarity, because I do think that it's terribly important, and it's one of the most destructive constructions we've ever had. Mary Daly famously talked about complementarity in terms of women and men as half of John Wayne pasted on half of Farrah Fawcett Majors, and which I thought was really clever in her. Yeah, although I think the trans questions have to be raised more in a more serious way than all that. But I do think one of the problems, and I'd love to hear from other people now. Turn it over to you. If it's the case, and this is a question that I'm asking myself, but if it's the case that major religious traditions, and I'm going to speak as a Catholic here, have inspired us to do the work of social justice, and if we don't have those, where does that inspiration come from for future generations? Where do they get the ongoing, as it were, where's the renewable moral energy around doing social justice? Because what I worry about, and I don't stab knights over this, but I must say I do worry about the fact that as the institution is no longer capable of carrying the freight of certain values, especially what people in the Christian tradition have called gospel values, particularly things like feeding the hungry and sharing and caring for earth and so forth. You can't, at least in the US, you can't buy those at the grocery store. I mean, they really are not for sale. And so much of the culture would inspire people to do it quite differently. I mean, there's a reason why Donald Trump was elected. The worst part of it for people like me was to realize that more than a third of the country believes as he believes. They really are racist. They really are sexist. They really do believe that you should have all the money you can make. And that's a very hard thing to realize. But what are some of the resources for countering that now very powerful message? So that's the question that I come to you with, and that's what I think feminist work in religion in the past has been able to. Why don't we can we turn this off?
Yeah.
My voice is loud enough.
Try that one. Maybe it's the battery or something.
Could be. Or else we can do without. But I think that's a real issue for me. Where then do those values come from? And they come from lots of different traditions, and they come from lots of places other than from religions. But have you, what are you thinking about? I don't mean to co-opt the conversation in that direction, but what are you thinking about in Ireland about that? As you see fewer than 30% of yourselves, as it were, being regular attenders of religious services and so on. How does that work?
My initial response to that would be that we had 66% of the voters in Ireland voted for the repeal of the 8th Amendment in May.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge step. It hasn't been mentioned tonight. It was only officially repealed a few days ago. But our last 3 referenda, divorce, marriage equality, and abortion, all of them were passed by a majority. The 8th Amendment referendum was a huge majority and a huge surprise, I use inverted commas, to those who were not involved in the campaign, but to those who were very passionately involved in the campaign, thankfully, was still a beautiful surprise. What I'm saying here is in response to your question of how will we find this moral compass if we are not aligned with faith paths, I think the faith paths maybe give us a door to push against, but also that this was a huge tectonic shift. I mean, this is Ireland, Catholic Ireland, that we were still trying to be convinced of with the Pope's visit. I mean, I think there was the hope that the Pope's visit would be a triumphalist, haha, the referendum didn't pass. And it became a bit of a damp squib. But still, people of Ireland have a strong faith, and their own strong, powerful faith that they can navigate themselves and self-navigate, to use the GPS analogy. So I don't know the full, obviously, and comprehensive answer, but I think that's a really powerful testament to the ability of people of faith to self-navigate and self-regulate and find their own direction. And I think women are hugely at the forefront of that, because it was women's conversations that got that referendum over the threshold. Women's conversations with each other, but also with their families, and speaking our truth, and actually coming out there and saying, actually, we're not going to be stigmatised and tabooed and traumatised anymore. We're going to actually get rid of the shame, speak it out, and talk about it. And it really brought us forward. So I think I really wanted to mention the 8th tonight. I was like, oh my God, we're here, all these people. We've had this huge thing. And
and I think, you know, to me, those are such signal accomplishments. And I was just in Madrid for the weekend for a conference, as I mentioned, and the closing was a Catholic, you know, sort of progressive, what I call Catholics on the edge of the pews kind of conference. It was the 38th such theological congress, and the closing liturgy for this, which normally would have been a mass for the first 37 years, was a Eucharist, celebrated by the LGBTIQ community among them, with a rainbow flag covered altar, rainbow candles, and young queer people coming down in the procession, and 12 people on stage who were all identified within the LGBTIQ community. And it was myself included, and it was really a way of their celebrating their move in that direction, obviously grateful to you and others, but also a way of listening to what people said afterwards, which was, 5 years ago this would never have happened. And so how rapid that change is. But here's my question. Even, say, on the question of divorce, which I completely, hello, but where do we get the resources to talk with young people, I say this as a mother of a teenager, about the nature of healthy, good, holy, and natural relationships? What are the resources for doing that? That's what I think is a challenge to feminist work in religion. How do we articulate to our children what that looks like now? And that some relationships don't work, and some relationships are with boys, and some are with girls, and some are with whatever. And this is very clear that some of us will be trans, some of us will be cisgender. There's lots of different things to talk about, but what are the resources for having that conversation? That's what I'm looking for. The same thing with equal marriage. I couldn't be more for it, and I'm married for economic reasons. But is there more there that we need to talk about in terms of not simply replicating a culture where people who are lucky in love are lucky under the law? How do we raise, I feel like I'm lucky in love, but I'm also now lucky under the law. Well, what about my single cousin who's not lucky in love? What happens to him under the law? And all those kinds of deeper questions. Those come to me, at least out of certain religious conversations. And the same thing with abortion, that we now are having a really important conversation led by African American women especially, around not the right to choose, but reproductive justice. We've changed the frame of how we think about that, particularly in terms of genocidal questions and who gets to choose to have a child. And so that the conversation around reproductive justice is the conversation as much about choosing to have a child as not, for which a precondition, of course, is to have legal abortion and economically accessible abortion. So, but that's where I'm trying to take it the next step. Now once we get these things, they're not the end of the world either. And yet, where do the resources come to have those hard conversations once we've done, quote unquote, the right thing in terms of the law? So, anyway, let's hear from other people. That's what
Just very briefly, because I think that's what I was trying to ask you. Where are we going to find a good working theology of human sexuality? And
the Catholic institutional church. Then you can save your time. Rosemary Ruther used to say, when I see a book that has an imprimatur, I know I don't need to read it.
Well, can I just mention the one that I've mentioned at loads of other talks recently, Margaret Fairley's, and I'm sure you know that one, Just Love.
Yeah.
And I think her whole premise is that all relationships, sexual if you like, and other ones, are all sort of prefaced on the fact that there has to be justice. I think it's a good starting point, and the fact she didn't have an imprimatur, in fact she was fairly savaged when she produced that book. She is actually, I think, a mercy nun, but I think it's a tremendous starting point for trying to articulate some theology of human sexuality, which I think the world urgently needs.
Yeah. Her name is Margaret Farley, Farley. She's a religious Sister of Mercy. And she's being honored this year at the American Academy of Religion, not just for this book, although it's important, but also for a signal accomplishment of hers and other of her sisters, which has been to work with sisters in Africa on the AIDS question. And so there again, you see somebody who's doing tremendous theoretical work and theological work, deeply engaged in the struggle for healthcare. That's what I'm talking. That to me is the quintessential case of feminist spirituality, feminist working religion. How about other people? Go ahead. I need to pass this or throw it or whatever you do.
Mary,
Please.
You referred to the reframing the basic question, but we never asked what is the basic question. Like what is the question about being alive? You know, like all of these isms and the new understandings, new insights, they're all refreshing and welcome. But what is the basic question that we need to look at?
Well, I'm not sure that. I didn't get your name.
Mary.
Oh, Mary. Thanks.
Mary Magdalene.
Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
Great. Mary Elizabeth. In a crowd like this, if you say Mary, you're half the time right.
And closet work.
Yeah, I don't know that there is one question, Mary. I think that what it means to be a protagonist of one's own spirituality, or a person is to entertain a wide range of questions. I mean, there are some people who it wouldn't occur to them some of the things that keep me up nights. And I think that's part of the problem, that somehow, especially in the Catholic tradition, we have a game show on television in the States called Jeopardy, where do you know what I'm talking about? And they give you the answer, and then you have to ask the question. You pick a category, and then they give you an answer, and then you have to say what's the question that goes with it. Well, in the Catholic way of doing theology, and especially doing moral or ethical theology, we didn't even get to pick the categories. We just got the answers, and if you weren't asking the question, it didn't really matter. And I think that's really part of the problem, is to invite people to surface their own questions. I don't think there's one. The meaning of life. But one of the things that is clear to me, and that I would go to the grave with, is that every person has the human right to dignity, to respect, and to the basics of this world, and that's what we don't have. I mean, in my country, the gaps, the enormous, astronomical gaps, economic gaps, just to start with, and what that means in terms of healthcare, food, education for children especially from so-called minority, although increasingly majority, racial ethnic groups, and particularly for immigrants. The notion that in a country of immigrants, the children of immigrants have been taken away from their parents in the process of becoming, who are refugees, who've come to seek refuge, the taking of their children, that is so unspeakable and so pernicious that it says something about a culture that has these enormous gaps, that people can do that to each other. And that I'm very clear is a bottom line. But there are going to be lots of ways to look at that. The question is, how do you get in dialogue with people who see these things so terribly differently and who have power to make them happen? I mean, that's our dilemma in the U.S. I mean, we have Trump looking at a second term, a real possibility of a second term. We have a Supreme Court justice case right now, a man, Mr. Kavanaugh, who's being vetted to be one of the 9 Supreme Court justices. If he gets if he is named by the Senate to the court, we will have a permanent, or at least for a while, majority of 5 conservatives, which can roll back abortion, can roll back same-sex marriage, could roll back divorce, could roll back anything they want, and are prepared to do it. Why? Because we also have enormous money coming from Catholic sources that have set up entire law schools to prepare people, for example, to overturn Roe versus Wade, the abortion. We had a guy who sold pizzas, Tom Monahan, who sold pizzas at Domino's Pizza. And he made so much money that by the time he sold the company, he set up the Ave Maria Law School in order to prepare lawyers for exactly these cases. And they're very effective. And to get Kavanaugh in there is a nightmare. They have a whole strategy. So we've got enormous work to do before even those questions of what's it all about, for most people, will ever surface. Thanks, Mary.
I have a question.
Another question? Do you need the mic?
No, it's okay, I'll speak loudly. You're all historians to some extent. What's the role of history in this? What are we supposed to look at? Our history of Catholic theology, of Christian theology, of the church fathers like Aquinas and Augustine. How do we incorporate the history of our church into the modern day?
Thanks, Peter. I stupidly said I was a historian, art historian. I think, not wanting to shoot it back to Mary, but one of the things, and I didn't articulate it very well, but the idea of replication and women in the canon, what are we looking at? What are we reading? What are we being produced into? What are the symbolic structures that we are, that we are psychically attuned to? And back to Mary Condren's work here, that these are ingrained with us for so long, and it's really, when we think about, it's really only 200 years of first wave feminism, less with second wave feminism. And this kind of feminism has gone too far, sort of school of rhetoric, when we haven't even begun. We have millennia of imagery, whether it's religious, musical, textual, visual, psychic, psychological, to unravel and to find what is valuable in it and use it again. But that for me anyway is the role of the historian or the art historian, or as well as the thing of recovery, like finding and talking about how important Hildegard of Bingen is, but also actually the very unpicking the very structures within which we have been formed, men and women.
Yeah, I also think that there is an enormous role here for imagination. And that Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza's work on the imaginative reconstruction of early Christianity is an example of something that's terribly creative and awfully necessary. And one of the things I've tried to play with in some of my writing has been imagination and the doing of ethics. And my rationale is that nobody I know, it goes back to the fact that we usually, at least in the US, we talk about the difference between justice and violence. So we are a land of liberty and justice for all, where violence is something that happens to people. Well, it's actually the reverse, I think. We live in a violent context where justice is very much episodic. Once in a while we see justice. And why we have to bring imagination into it is because none of us have ever lived in a context that was just, or in a religious framework that was inclusive. And so we have to imagine what that might be like. And I think the work of imagination helps also to break down some of the hierarchy within thinking and scholarship and so forth, and that the imaginations of people and how they worship, how they articulate the deepest, most meaningful things in their lives, and I'm thinking here particularly about women's groups that are here present, what you do in your women's groups, thinking to colleagues in the back there, and really what you do in your women's group is as important as what someone does in scholarship here at Trinity College. And what you do in your religious communities that are breaking some of the molds without advertising them necessarily in places where you might have a little backlash, or even advertising them so you do get a little backlash, which I would encourage. Those are really important parts of the work that needs to be done, and those are all feminist efforts. I'm going to pass it on to Mary Condren, whose name we've taken in vain, and I will not pass this to you without saying thank you one more time.
I'm absolutely stunned at the richness of this evening, and I know that the conversation has only begun, and I know that there are many questions that all of us have and would like to ask of Mary and would like to ask of the panel, and this is all the more reason why we need to support one another in the various work we are doing in relation to women's spirituality, religion, ethics, and ritual. And to do so in very constructive ways. But for this evening, I would like to simply thank our panel, Noreen Irian, and Gina. And I also want to thank Christine. Where's she gone? She's the parish priest who gave us the land of the hall. Chaired our event so ably and so generously. And finally, and I never do this without crying, I'm the last person in the world to be doing this, I want to sincerely thank my dear friend and colleague Mary Hunt, who is at the end of a long journey in the past week or two, and this was the icing on the cake that she was able to be here this evening. Not only to be here, but to actually spend the time preparing the kind of lecture that she did. I would work from headings, good luck, whatever comes out, comes out. But clearly, she has put an enormous amount of time and effort and work into her presentation this evening. And there's reams and reams and reams more of that wisdom and generosity and theology, if I can just say so, to come. So Mary, you have to come back again. I mean,